Hello, this is Musictechhelpguy, and welcome to episode 48 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the ES2 synthesizer in Logic. And the ES2 is a synth that's been around for quite a while. It's not a new synth, but I do think it's one of the more versatile, wave-based synths in Logic, and it's one of my personal all-time favorite synths as well. One of the things I want you to realize about the ES2 is that there are many different E-synths back from the E-Magic days of Logic, ES2, ES1, ESP, ESM, ESE. We will not be going over all of these. I'm going to be covering the ES2 and the EFM1. All of the other ones, the EMP and ES1, all of those all contain the features that the ES2 has, but just don't quite have the level of features that the ES2 has. So if you can figure out how to use the ES2, you can pretty much figure out how to use those other four. All right, one other thing I want to mention, just like I mentioned in the retro synth video in the previous episode, is that this is in no way a complete tutorial for the ES2. This is just an overview to show you how to get going and using the synth. If you really are interested in a complete tutorial, I actually have already done a 4-part 2-hour-long ES2 tutorial if you are interested, although the quality of the audio is not quite as good as this video, and it was also done in Logic 9, not in 10, but nothing's really changed. It's still the same synthesizer. So the stock sound for the ES2 sounds like this. It's just a very basic sort of polysynth sound. I'm going to start with one of the presets. So if you're trying to follow along, you can use this preset. I'm going to use the preset that's under Synth Leads, and it is called Electric Buzz. And Electric Buzz is just kind of a monophonic sort of bass or lead instrument. And one of the things you'll immediately find with the ES2 is it's much more versatile and has much more modulation ability than the retro synth did. So you have the ability to create much more complex synth patches. So to start, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn off all of these modulation routers. We'll talk about what these do later, but I kind of want to start with a more stock sound. So the way you can turn these off is just hold Option and click on the targets of each one of these, and you'll turn off those modulation routers. Another thing I want to do is I want to turn the filter off for the time being, and you can turn this whole filter wheel off just by clicking here where it says filter. So filter's in gray, the filter is off. I also want to pull this sine level knob down. And I actually, if you have any distortion on or the chorus flanger phaser on, I would pull the intensity of those down as well because we don't really want to hear those quite yet. And then the last thing I'm going to adjust is I'm going to turn the vector mode from mix and XY to off. And so essentially what we're hearing now is just the oscillators plus just our volume envelope over here. And we'll, like I said, we'll come back to all this stuff in just a moment. So the ES2 has 3 oscillators. They're labeled here 1, 2, and 3. And you can turn each one of them on or off just by clicking on the number right next to the waveform selection. So for now, let's just start with oscillator 1, and we'll keep numbers 2 and 3 off. The knob just next to the number shows which waveform you have selected. So you can choose from a sine wave, a triangle wave, a sawtooth, a square wave with a short up pulse, as well as a sine wave as an FM carrier. What I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to turn this on polyphonic mode, and I'm going to turn unison off. We'll talk about that later. I'm going to pull up my voices to a bit of a higher value. It doesn't have to be, the maximum value, but I'll pull it up to a higher value. And I'm also going to pull this analog knob down. I'll explain why I'm making all these changes in just a moment. So basically what I have here is just a sine wave, and it should sound somewhat like just a sine wave. Yeah, nothing special there. What we can do is, on our oscillator, we can change to a different waveform. And as we discussed in the previous video, going from sine, triangle, square to sawtooth, that's the order in which the waveforms get more complex. The overtone series in those waveforms get more complex. So the sine wave is going to be the simplest sound you can have. The triangle wave is going to be a little more complex, but still kind of a dull sound. The square wave is going to be kind of bright. And then the sawtooth is going to be the kind of the most fuzzy, the grittiest, most complex sound. And then we also have this shortened up pulse square wave. And remember in the previous episode, we talked about pulse width modulation. And basically what pulse width modulation is when you can shorten or lengthen the up pulse of a square wave. And so when you go from a 50-50 square wave like this, and you go to a shortened up pulse, there's less energy in the signal, and so you end up having a thinner tone. But sometimes it's a distinct sort of metallic sound that you might want. So there you go. We'll come back to this FM option in just a moment. So I'm going to stick oscillator 1 on a square wave. The knob just to the left of the waveform selection is the tuning of that oscillator. You can tune each of the oscillators up or down by 36 semitones, so basically up or down by 3 full octaves. I'm just going to option click on that and set it to its its standard stock value. And you can also detune each oscillator in cents as well, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Next, let me turn on oscillator 2. And I'm also going to set the tuning for this to 0 as well. For oscillator 2, you get a few extra options. You get a square wave that you can adjust the pulse width on. So instead of just getting a short and a 50-50 pulse wave, a square wave, you actually get the whole gamut of a 50-50 all the way up to a shortened pulse. So you can modulate the pulse like this. And again, the shorter the pulse is, the more thin, metallic this tone sounds. You have your sawtooth, your triangle wave, as well as your sine wave like before, but we also have these synced waveforms as well as a ring modulator. With the synced waveforms, you may recall from the previous episode we talked about oscillator sync, where you can sync two waveforms and you have essentially a master waveform and a slave waveform. That's essentially what's happening here. You can sync a square wave to oscillator 1, and you can also sync a sawtooth to oscillator 1. And so when you do that, you can adjust the tuning of the slave waveform, which is number 2, and you can kind of alter not necessarily the tuning, but the tone of it. You can vary the tone. If we were just to use a regular, two regular sawteeth, and you alter the tuning of oscillator 2, you're just going to create harmony. So here I've got a 7 semitone, the second oscillator is raised up 7 semitones, so it's a perfect fifth. So I have two oscillators that are in harmony at a perfect fifth. But if I use the synced option, it creates a tonal shift, like a timbre change. So almost this kind of metallic biting tone is what we get. All right, so for oscillator 3 has many of the same options as oscillator 2, except that ring modulation is replaced by a noise generator. So on oscillator 3, if you choose noise, you basically just have an oscillator that generates white noise. It doesn't matter where you play on the keyboard, you're going to get the same sound. So what is a ring modulator, by the way? Ring modulation is when you can take the signal of two oscillators and you can add and subtract, so you get the sum and difference of all of the overtones in the overtone series of those two waveforms. I believe offhand that the ring modulator on oscillator 2 is a square wave. So if I choose a square wave up on oscillator 1 and then change the the tuning, what you're actually going to hear is the fundamental of these two waveforms plus the addition and subtraction of every single overtone in the overtone series of these two waveforms. And so you get a kind of a metallic biting sound as well, similar to like the synced oscillator. But it's a little bit more distorted. You can hear there's a little bit of dissonance in there as well. The only thing I haven't talked about, let's go down to oscillator 3, is this particular preset has this, the sine wave replaced to something that says mean. And what does that mean? Well, what does mean mean? Mean is actually one of many digi-waves that you can pick from. These digi-waves are essentially just a wavetable is all they are. They're a set of 100 different waveforms you can pick from, and they're just given different, descriptions, things like cold or organ or, piano. They don't actually sound like a piano, but they kind of embody the sort of the overtone series or the overall tone of that particular instrument. So you can use them as kind of a starting point to build your overall patch. The way you access these is you simply right-click on where it would normally say in sine wave, and then you'll find, you'll get a whole list of these different digi-waves. So let's say I want, the one that says, one of the organs, I'll say organ number 3. So this is what organ number 3 sounds like. So kind of like an organ sound with a little bit of a bell tone above it. And you can do that for all three oscillators. Any of the ones that say, well, they all say sine at the bottom. You can right click on that and you can change that to any of the different digi waves. So let's do this. I'm going to stick with mean 2 up here. I'm going to go with a slightly shortened up pulse square wave on number 2, and number 3 I'll go with a sawtooth. And currently I have all three of them at the same tuning. We'll change that in just a moment. The other thing you can do with your three oscillators is you can balance them. That's what this triangle here does. This is the balance between the three oscillators. So you can move this around. You'll hear more of 1, more of 2, or more of 3, depending on where you put this point in the triangle. So you can find a blend that fits the sound that you're looking for. Now, one quick thing I want to show you before we move on from the oscillators is that oscillator 1 has a sine wave up here that says, basically has a slider all the way up to FM. What this does is it actually turns oscillator 1 into an FM carrier wave, and then oscillators 2 and 3 are modulating waves. And we talked a bit about this in the previous episode with FM synthesis, but if I set this to sine wave, set this one to the sine wave with the FM slider, essentially number 2 is our modulating wave, and number 1 is our carrier wave. And as I pull this up, I'm pulling up the FM depth, and you'll hear more of those kind of classic FM sounds. And you can change what you want the modulator to be. So I can actually make the modulator a sawtooth and the carrier a sine wave. So there you go. So I'm going to go back to what we had before, though. In addition to being able to adjust the triangle over here, you can also set each of the oscillators to a different tuning. So let's say that I want my sawtooth to be down an octave, that's 12 semitones. Maybe I want my second oscillator to be up an octave, and I want oscillator 1 to be right in tune. You can have them all in different octaves and create a different sort of blended tonality. So now we're getting sort of like an organ-ish sort of sound. Another thing that we discussed in the previous episode was being able to fine-tune the oscillators and adjust the tuning in sense. You can do that same thing here. And one of the things that we said we could do is we said you can take two oscillators that are on the same pitch and you can slightly detune them in sense. Now, in the previous episode, I just bumped one oscillator up 10 cents, and it created a nice chorus effect, and then I had to go retroactively bump the entire tuning of the entire synth down 5 cents, because the frequency that we hear when we detune two oscillators is in between the two oscillators. So if I bump one of them up 10 cents, then the overall frequency, the overall pitch of the whole oscillator we're gonna perceive that as plus 5 cents. So what we can do here is we actually have independent detuning of the oscillators. So I can pull oscillator 1 up by 5 cents, and I can pull oscillator 2 down by 5 cents. Let's actually go a little bit further. Let's go 7 cents. And we'll get a bit of a chorus effect now. So this a little bit richer tone than we would have before. Next, let's talk about the global controls up here. We have polyphonic, monophonic, legato, a voice count, as well as a unison mode, which we didn't see in the previous synth. At least it was there, but it wasn't labeled unison. In polyphonic mode, you can have up to 32 voices. And if you check the unison button, what happens is the voices half. And the reason why they half is in unison mode, you're actually doubling up your voices on every key. So right now I have, with unison mode off, I have 3 oscillators on every single key you play. If you check this, you're now going to have 2 of each of the oscillators in every key. So you're going to get a little bit of a thicker, louder tone. So you get a little bit bigger tone. The other thing that you can do, and this was the same thing as the double option in the retro synth. The other thing that you can do with this is when unison is on, you can go over to this analog knob and you can pull this up. And what this does is it emulates analog pitch drift, because in analog synthesizers, the pitch of an oscillator may not always be perfectly in tune. So if you have all 3 oscillators doubled on every key, so we have 6 oscillators per key, and you start to detune those even further than our manual detuning, you can get a really rich chorus effect. If you pull this up too much, though, it'll just start to sound out of tune. So there's a fine line between out of tune and chorus. What you can also do is you can set your mode to monophonic or legato. In the previous video, we explained the difference between the two. And the basic difference is that in monophonic mode, you can only play one note at a time. And then in legato mode, the envelope doesn't restart itself for every note, so you get a bit of a smoother tone out of it. So this is great for arpeggios and melodic ideas. Now, monophonic mode and legato mode are treated a little bit different when you turn unison mode on than polyphonic mode is. When you turn polyphonic mode and unison on, it halves the voice count because it doubles up the number of voices on every key. In mono or legato mode, when you turn unison on, the number of voices that you see in that display is the number of voices that you have on every single key. So what's crazy about this is if you have legato unison 32 voices on, that means that you have 32 sets of oscillators on every single key that you play. So that means that we have 3 oscillators times 32 voices. So basically 96 notes on every single key, which seems crazy, but once you play a key, it's super loud, and it has this really rich, almost like a flanger effect on it because of the detuning that we have over here. So what I'm going to do just before I play this is pull the volume control down a bit, because otherwise this is going to clip. Actually, I can probably pull it up a bit more there. So this really rich chorus effect now that you can't get in polyphonic. If I go back to polyphonic now, it's a rich chorus effect, but not as thick sounding as that legato mode that we had. So for now, I'm going to stick with poly and unison. All right, the next control I want to show you is not the filter, but actually the controls on the right side here. You have a master volume control. This just controls the volume of the entire synthesizer. You can pull that up, pull it down. You can also introduce an extra sine wave into your oscillators, much like we did in the retro synth. So if you need to reinforce the bass, you can pull this up. And it'll layer a sine wave underneath your current oscillators. There's also a built-in flanger, phaser, or chorus effect. So I'll go with the flanger and pull the intensity up a bit. Here's what the phaser sounds like. And then the speed is just the speed at which the phaser or flanger or chorus moves at. And you can also add distortion as well. You can choose between a hard and soft distortion. The hard distortion is going to sound more like a solid state, distorted sound, whereas the soft distortion is going to sound more like almost like a tube overdrive, if you will. So I'm actually not going to use the distortion. I'm not going to use the modulation either. And we'll come back to it, but this XY pad, believe it or not, has nothing to do with these faders around, or these knobs around it. It's a bit misleading because you look at these 6 knobs and you're like, oh, it has to do something with this XY pad. It actually has nothing to do with the XY pad. So we'll talk about that later. Next, let's talk about the filter. I'm going to turn the filter on. And the filter in the ES2 is essentially not one, but 2 filters. You have filter 1 here, filter 2 here. The filters can be in series or in parallel, and you can choose between the 2 right here. Parallel basically means that the signal from the oscillators is split in 2. Half of it's sent through filter 1, half is sent through filter 2, and then they're joined and blended on the opposite side. In series, this means that the signal is going to pass through filter 1, then that signal is going to pass through filter 2, and then go to the output. So for a bit more of a balanced sound, I'm going to go with parallel. The first thing I'm going to do is just to demonstrate filter 1 by itself, I'm going to pull this blend knob all the way up, and so you'll only hear filter 1. Now filter 1, like most filters, has a cutoff frequency and a resonance control. And you can also choose between 5 different types of filters. You have low pass, high pass, peak, band reject, and band pass. And in the previous video, we discussed that a low pass filter is a filter that allows lows but cuts highs. High pass is one that allows highs but cuts lows. Band reject cuts a middle band of frequencies but keeps lows and highs. And band pass cuts highs and lows but keeps a middle band of frequencies. We also said that a peak filter is kind of like just a band boosting a band in an EQ. So for what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose for filter 1, I'm going to choose a band reject, actually choose a band pass filter. And the cutoff frequency here is going to essentially adjust the center frequency of that band. So I'm going to pull the resonance down, just play with this just so you can hear what it sounds like. So you can choose between a higher or lower emphasis. With the low pass and the high pass, this is actually a cutoff frequency. Cutting out the highs, letting the highs back in. With high pass, cutting out the lows, and then letting the lows back in. So I'm going to stick with the band pass for now. And we'll come back to resonance when we get to filter 2, which is right now. So let's check out filter 2. I'm going to pull the blend all the way down so we just hear filter 2. Filter 2, unlike filter 1, is a dedicated low-pass filter. You cannot change it to any other type of filter. It, too, has a cutoff frequency and resonance control. So what I'm going to do is set the cutoff where I feel like it sounds best. There we go. And you can choose between 3 different cutoff slopes. You have 12 dB, 18 dB, and 24 dB. So the larger the slope, the steeper the slope. So a 24 dB cut means that you have 24 decibels of attenuation per octave. So 12 dB would be a bit more gradual slope. Let's go with 18. The fat option basically acts kind of like a low frequency shelf. It just boosts the low frequency. I'm not going to turn that on, but you can play around with it. And then you can also add resonance. Remember that resonance is a boost in the frequency at the cutoff frequency. So if I pull up the resonance, you get a bit of a high frequency shimmer at the cutoff frequency. And then what you can do is, because we're in parallel, I can actually blend these 2 filters together and find the best sound. So that's band passed, low passed. And then we can have a combined band pass and low passed. There we go. All right, let's take a look at, before we move on to the modulation routers, let's take a look at our envelopes down here. There are 3 envelopes. 2 of them, envelopes 1 and 2, can be used for modulation techniques. Envelope 3 is a dedicated volume envelope. And so it's essentially an amplitude or an amplifier envelope, whatever you want to call it. It has 4 stages: attack, decay, sustain, and release. We'll talk about time later. And if I want to create more of like a synth lead or bass sort of sound, you want to make sure that your attack time is set low so the sound immediately enters. And you want to make sure that the release time is set rather low, because then you press the key, the sound immediately enters, and you let go of the key, and the sound immediately dies away. So this is meant for basses and leads. Not really meant for pads or chord type instruments. If I want to create more of a pad or like synth string type of instrument, I'm going to make sure that I pull the attack time up a bit and pull the release time up a bit, so I get a more of a fade in and a fade out. And I actually want even more than that. So I get a very, very sort of gentle, soft fade in and fade out. All right, so now that I've got that set up, let's talk about these modulation routers. The modulation routers are a way to take modulation sources, either like a direct control like your modulation wheel or a fader or something like that, or a built-in modulation source like an LFO or an envelope, and pair it up with an element of the synthesizer. So in the previous episode, we talked about, using an LFO to create vibrato. So let's create a basic vibrato effect here. Basically, each of the routers have a target and a source at the bottom. We'll talk about the via parameter later. The target is essentially what's being affected, and the source is what's doing the affecting. So if I'm creating a vibrato effect, the target would be pitch, and you can choose pitch 1, 2, or 3, and that's oscillator. The pitch of oscillators 1, 2, or 3, or you can say the pitch of all 3 oscillators, which I'm going to do. And then you can also say I want the source to be something. I'll say LFO1. And for the via parameter, for now, I'm just going to option click on that to turn it off. So since we've chosen LFO1 as our source, let's go down to LFO1. The LFO1 is a LFO that cannot be synchronized to the beat clock, so we can only adjust its rate in hertz. So I can pull this up, I can pull this down. Typically, vibrato is usually between about 2 and 6 hertz, so I'll make this about 3.5 hertz. There we go. And then you can choose a waveform for it. You can choose triangles, sawtooth, reverse sawtooth, unidirectional square, bidirectional square. There's a step and hold sort of random effect, as well as a smooth random. what we need to do to actually get vibrato is I need to pull up the depth of the modulation, because right now with this green fader right on 0, we have everything set up for vibrato, but we're not actually going to hear the vibrato until we pull it up. So if I play a note here, no vibrato. But if we actually pull this fader up a bit, we'll start to hear vibrato. And the more you pull this up, the deeper the effect will be. So we get more of like a siren effect there. So let's try something a little more useful. Let's try this with volume. And to do this with volume, you choose amp or amplitude or amplifier, whatever you want to call it. So with amp, instead of pitch moving up and down for vibrato, now we're going to create almost like a tremolo effect. And we can try one of our other waveforms as well. Let's try the sawtooth here. What you'll find is that because LFO1 is not synced to the beat clock, it's difficult to synchronize to the tempo of a song. It's also a polyphonic LFO, which means that each note essentially has its own LFO. So if you don't play all the notes at the exact same time, the kind of motion of the LFO effect will be off. But if you play them all at the same time, they'll all be together. The way around this is to actually use LFO2 instead of LFO1, because LFO2 not only lets you sync to the beat clock to musical values, it also is monophonic, which means that every single note shares the same LFO motion. So instead of LFO1 here, I'm going to choose LFO2. So let's try LFO2 at an 1/8 note pace. And then we'll choose, we'll go ahead and use the sawtooth as well. So no matter what rhythm I play, no matter when I play a particular note, the motion of the LFO effect always stays in time. Just for this, let me just pull the attack time down a bit and the release time down a bit, just so we can hear this a little better. And let me go ahead and pull the amount all the way up so we get a full volume effect. So again, no matter what rhythm I play, that effect's always going to stay in time. Let's try something else. Let's try modulating our filter cutoff. For the cutoffs, there's 2 options. Well, there's actually 3 options. There's 4 options. There's cutoff 1, cutoff 2, cutoff 1 and 2, and then cutoff 1 inverse 2. With cutoff 1, you're talking about modulating the filter cutoff, the cutoff of filter 1. Cutoff 2 is the cutoff of filter 2. Cut 1 and 2 is both of them, and cut 1 inverse 2 is basically this. When this one goes up, this one's going to go backwards. That's all that is. So let's try this on cut 1, and I'm going to put this on the triangle wave for this example. So just affecting cutoff 1 here. Let's try cutoff 2. Let's try both of them, cutoff 1 and 2. And let's try cutoff 1 inverse 2. Yeah, I find that I think cut 1 and 2 sounds the best here. One other thing I really like to use often on LFO2, because it's a synced LFO, is I like to use the square waves here. I'm going to go with the bi-directional square wave because the effect is a little bit deeper. And you can create really cool sort of like stuttered effects with this. Let's go with like a 16th note here. And so we have a very quick 16th note filter sweep. So you can create a patch that not only creates, you know, like a tonal chordal idea, but also gives sort of like a rhythmic idea to your song. And you can also layer up these modulation effects. Let's say I want LFO2 to control volume, amplitude here, to create a stutter effect. But then I want on a second router, I want LFO1 to control the cutoff of 1 and 2. And then maybe do that at a really slow rate. You can do that as well. So you've got this really slow filter sweep going on in the background, but then we've got this really rapid 16th note pulsing effect going on at the same time. What you can do with the via parameter is this is a way to control the depth of the modulation with either like a continuous controller or some other control source. Let's say that I want to control the amount of this stutter effect based on the placement of my modulation wheel. So we'll go to the via and we'll choose mod wheel. What that does is it splits up the fader into this dual fader. We'll click just on the 0 here to center it. And you can create a top and bottom range for the modulation. So if basically when the fader, when my modulation wheel is all the way down, the effect is going to be here toward the green triangle. And when the modulation wheel is all the way up, the effect is going to be more up here toward the orange triangle. So let's give that a shot. So modulation wheel down. I'll push the modulation wheel up. And then toward the end there, I push the modulation wheel back down again. So that's kind of cool. Let's move over to the envelopes. Envelope 3, like I said before, is a dedicated volume envelope. Envelopes 1 and 2 are envelopes that you can use for modulation effects. So just for now, I'm going to bypass my first 2 routers because I want to control my resonance of my second filter with my envelope here. So what I'll do is I'll say target, control, resonance number 2. There's resonance 1 as well, with envelope number 2. And if I want this to kind of be a slow motion, you pull up the attack time, pull down the decay time a bit, maybe set the sustain wherever you want it. And remember that the release time is going to be in part based on when your volume envelope's release time is. So I'll pull those, the attack and release up over here. And let's see what that sounds like now. So we get a little bit of that little airy, high frequency sound in there. But the main difference between an LFO and an envelope is that an LFO repeats itself over and over again. An envelope doesn't. The envelopes just happen once and then they're done. Now let's add both of these other 2 routers in there at the same time, and let's see what that does to the signal now. That big, long, sweeping sound is a result of having both a filter cutoff sweep as well as a resonance sweep at the same time. I don't quite want that much. I'm just going to pull the fader down just a little bit, but that's essentially the effect I was going for. And I can always pull the resonance down a bit more too if I don't want to hear quite as much of that. So you can see really quickly that although we have 10 modulation routers, a lot of times you only have to use 2 or 3 or 4 to get the sound that you're looking for. But this is one of the reasons why I love the ES2 is it has so many modulation routers. It allows you to do almost anything you'd want to do. All right, so I'm not done yet with the ES2, but I am done for this video. I learned my lesson in the previous episode that making 50-minute long YouTube videos is bad because it takes forever to upload them. So I'm going to cut this video short here, and I will pick up the second half of the ES2 overview in episode 49. So thanks for watching.